This talk is about the role of value judgments in science, and specifically the role of value judgments in scientific methods. A lot of the debates on values in science have revolved around a specific notion of how the sciences can be claimed to be free of values, called impartiality, which is the claim that the internal reasoning of science is free of social values, such that scientific theories are accepted or rejected purely based on their relation to available material evidence according to the highest available standards. Impartiality is often employed or invoked as a concept when discussions are had about the legitimacy or permissibility of politically contentious research. In this talk, I will consider how the notion of impartiality is employed in value debates in philosophy and social studies of science, and suggest that there is a specific concept of science motivating these debates and determining their structure. I'll then offer an alternative pragmatist concept of science, which doesn't need to debate the impartiality of scientific methods in order to legitimate claims of the intrinsic need for science to consider its values and social and political effects. First, let's look at examples of how impartiality is operated in discussions on the role of values in science. To take a historical example, when scientists were working on the atomic and hydrogen bomb in the 40s and 50s, people called for the research to be halted or for ethics boards to place limitations on scientific freedom. In response, physicists like Percy Bridgman and Edward Teller said that such calls are misguided because nuclear physics proper is a value-free practice of simply seeking to understand an external world and its governing laws. Teller said, the scientist is not responsible for the laws of nature. It's his job to find out how these laws operate. And Bridgman said, science simply invokes evidence to face the challenge of an external world not understood. Similar arguments are made today on the more theoretical topic of cognitive differences research. In response to demonstrated harm and risk to women and racial minorities as a result of the publication of scientific research on gender and race-related cognitive differences, some scholars of science urge limitations on science's autonomy in the form of restrictions on these research programs. And in this case, we see similar appeals to impartiality of scientific methods being made to justify this politically contentious research. What's problematic about cognitive differences research, they claim, is not the questions asked, or even the results sometimes obtained, but the prejudiced, the racist and sexist context in which the research takes place, because the internal reasoning of science is value-free. The issue of impartiality is also at the heart of the science wars, which started in the 1990s and still creates a lot of animosity between scientists and social studies of science researchers today. You have scientists like Gross and Levitt who say, look, we get that science has been used for military hardware, surveillance of dissidents, destructive and environmentally unsound industrial practices, and the manipulation of mass consciousness through the technologies of popular culture. And some research might even be unacceptable by feminist lights. But the implementation, the application of that knowledge is a social and political decision, and does not belong to scientific method and its practice per se. Ultimately, as long as empiricist procedure is followed, the actual knowledge you produce is guaranteed to be value-free and objective. If you want to complain about something, it's not the research itself, it's the society, government, institutions that are using it. On the other side in the science wars, you have science studies scholars like Lewontin and Ross who say actually it's not at all obvious that the methods and problematic of natural science produce an objective picture of the world untainted by ideology and by the social and political predispositions of scientists. And this notion of scientific methods' impartiality is actually a dogma, which is used to fend off social criticism and to protect professional contracts with the corporate military state. These counterarguments also revolve around scientific methods' impartiality by showing how social and political values seep into the internal reasoning of science. Longino's analysis of gender differences research, for example, showed that a variety of sexist and heteronormative assumptions were required in order to draw its conclusions from its evidence. So there's really nothing about scientific methods, its internal reasoning, that gives it this right to consider itself exempt from the politics it's creating in the world. What I'll be contending is that this profound and emotionally charged disagreement over impartiality really comes from a shared metaphysical conceptualization of what science and its methods are claiming to be and to do for us, which has been inherited from at least the logical empiricists and most likely much further back in history. And, as I'll discuss afterwards, this notion of science is actually maladaptive, unnecessary, and also, from the perspective of evolutionary biology, unscientific. If we replace this common sense notion of science with a pragmatist one, we don't run into the same kinds of conflict. As many of you will know, the logical positivist notion of science was a rule-governed mechanical method inevitably bringing any given inquirer to the same theoretical position based on the same evidence. Carnap's theory of science attempted to show that valid scientific knowledge was derived from the rules of logic and mathematics applied to basic, verifiable observation statements or protocol sentences. Any statement or corresponding belief inflected with value judgments or other forms of subjectivity was therefore definitionally excluded from the operations of scientific theory construction, guaranteeing a scientific method insulated from the influence of values. Reichenbach undertook a similar project with his rational reconstruction of scientific inquiry. The notion of science motivating these projects was that through the practice of scientific method and the precise and careful exclusion of the human being from its processes, it could reveal the true qualities of nature, absent any distorting influences of human subjectivity. The notion of objectivity being employed here is one of nature as it really is, whose qualities the human being can observe if they are careful to avoid the traps of their own imported subjective experiential qualities. Debates over values in science have generally followed these lines. Kuhn challenged the procedural nature and universality of scientific method by demonstrating the insufficiency of methodological directives by themselves to dictate a unique substantive conclusion to many sorts of scientific questions. The scientific methodological principles like accuracy, consistency, scope, simplicity, and fruitfulness actually operate in scientific method not as rules which determine choice, but as values which influence it. So, an inquirer who is adequately following scientific methodological directives may nevertheless legitimately reach any one of a number of incompatible conclusions influenced by their individual makeup. And in this way, subjectivity is introduced into scientific method. Then philosophers began discussing a possible categorical distinction between these epistemic values, which promote the truth-like character of science, and non-epistemic values, which promote any other kind of goal, including political, moral, social, and religious goals. So although different scientists make different choices due to differences in their individual training, preferences, character, and background, there would still be a clear dividing line between legitimate and illegitimate criteria for theory choice, which leaves intact the value neutrality of scientific methods. As we've already touched upon, feminist epistemologists challenged this epistemic, non-epistemic distinction by showing that the epistemic values operating in the internal reasoning of scientific methods actually employ a whole bunch of non-epistemic values to reach their conclusions. What I want to do is pause for a minute and abstract from these debates to look at the pragmatist theory of science, especially John Dewey's, that was around at the same time as the logical empiricists, and suggest that the debates over values in science and science's accountability for its social effects might have been very different if the pragmatist perspective had been more widely adopted. I argue that it doesn't get caught up trying to challenge the impartiality of methods and internal reasoning. It accepts the spectacular reliability and effectiveness of scientific methods in bringing us to adequate understandings of our environment. But at the same time, it can easily assert the deep value relativity of science and demand the accountability of scientific research. How does it do that? Dewey's theory of science said, let's stop thinking about science as a practice seeking a transcript of nature, where nature is separate to humanity, and start trying to understand what science is in terms of its coevolution and function in human life and societies. To quote Dewey, upon the biological level, organisms, like humans, have to respond to conditions about them in ways that modify those conditions and the relations of organisms to them, so as to restore the reciprocal adaptation that is required for the maintenance of life functions. Inquiry is one sophisticated form of such response. In this picture, science is not a way we might reveal the objective nature of reality by separating the real qualities of nature from the subjective distortions of the mind using scientific method. It's a process of honing in on and understanding specific qualities of the world, which are simple, stable, and reliably connected to other qualities, so we have the ability to intervene in our environment and manipulate it for the better. What that means for a picture of scientific method is that, in the course of trying to negotiate, manipulate, and secure the material conditions needed for successful living, humans have discovered that if we make certain assumptions in our inquiries, practices, and interactions, we get reliably positive results. These habitual assumptions are what have been concentrated into scientific methods. If we adopt these assumptions in our inquiries, then we will be able to securely and effectively manipulate our material environment in order to secure the ends we desire. But that doesn't mean these methods are a way to get to the objective nature of reality absent any values. These methods are practical habits carried over and systematized in the course of historical inquiries for their observed success in leading us towards beliefs or warranted assertions, which can be reliably and broadly used for the regulation and resolution of practical problems of human life. Following the pragmatist thread, impartiality may not be the best concept around which to structure our discussions on science and values, whether you're defending the impartiality of science or denying it. If the internal reasoning of scientific methods is not viewed as a way of getting at an objective representative picture of the world, but as a set of habitual assumptions adapted specifically for interventional success in bringing about beneficial environmental conditions for human life, then we don't really need to get caught up in arguments about the presence or absence of values in internal reasoning in order to sensibly and justifiably discuss the significance of values for science. The social and personal benefit of human intervention in order to manipulate and structure our environment in beneficial ways is the raison d'etre of science. Defining what counts as beneficial as we proceed with scientific research through time is where serious political claims and counterclaims can legitimately take place, making these kinds of values fundamentally connected to scientific methods, not external to them. We are within our rights to criticize scientific research if its effects on society are harmful, regardless of the robustness of the internal reasoning of science, because science is not about producing an objective transcript of reality, which pragmatists, by the way, don't take to be a coherent idea. Science is about enabling interventions in lived human environments. That doesn't mean in the slightest that we must argue that scientific methods are arbitrary or unreliable ways of understanding and engaging our environment. Scientific methods can be viewed as highly reliable and effective, even unsurpassed methods for manipulating and structuring certain qualities in our surroundings. The history of adaptation of scientific methods have brought about a robust set of habits of inquiry that enable interventions with reliable simplicity, broad scope, consistency, and fruitfulness. To conclude, in order to criticize the politics of science, we don't need to claim that scientific methods are anything less than excellent standards of inquiry into the manipulable qualities of the world. We can simultaneously hold that science is one of humanity's greatest and most powerful tools for bringing about reliable and effective interventions into the material qualities of our world, and make consistent politically based demands for the accountability of scientific research and the orientation of research programs towards problems affecting communities. Thanks for listening. Please leave a comment below if you have any questions or comments.